Hi everyone, today I'm excited to talk with a friend of mine, Daniel Mackler. He was on the show before. He has worked as a psychotherapist for many years. He's also a filmmaker, a writer, and musician. Welcome back to the show, Daniel.
Hi, Darius.
Hey, nice to have you. So, today I would like to talk about a broad topic that is relationships and touch on various aspects of it. And I would like to start by saying that the first relationship in a person's life is with their caregivers, and this combined with the relationship a child sees around him is the main model for other relationships in later life. Uh, that is, friendships, acquaintanceships, sexual relationships, romantic relationships. So, could you talk about how a child's bond with his caregivers and caregivers' relationships examples affect his or her future relationships and interactions with people later in life?
Well, I think you just summarized it pretty well, that a child's early relationships with his or her parents, that creates the template for how the child looks at the world and understands relationships, even understands in many ways his or her own relationship with himself. And those those parental relationships go very, very deep into a person, and so much so that it's those parental relationships, as good or as bad as they are, at a fundamental level, define the child's version of normalcy. That's what normal is. And so many people, it's so normal that they don't even realize that their parental relationships had such a profound effect on them. And I think to a degree that may even go for all of us, that we don't necessarily even realize that, because I think a lot of it comes back to how our relationship with our parents was when we were even babies, before we had regular memory as we would define it in adulthood. But children, little babies, that's where they define their sense of their connection to the world. And even at a below verbal level. It's just at an emotional level about love and abandonment. These are the primary issues. Receiving nurturance, feeling good, feeling safe, feeling anxious, questioning, trusting, and so those define the child's outlook on the world. And when that child grows up and the baby grows up, becomes a child, becomes a teenager, becomes an adult, they may not have necessarily any conscious connection between themselves as an adult and themselves as a baby and as a young child, but they're still operating on those templates. And the way that they're operating on those templates is there. For what I've observed, every child has with his or her parents some degree of a healthy and an unhealthy relationship with his parents. And as the result of that, the child grows up and still carries that healthiness and that unhealthiness into his or her adult relationships. I guess I'll just say his to make it simpler. And I think the healthy side of his relationships is the simple side. That's the side that people want to see, and that's the side that feels better, and that's the side that brings us into healthier relationships. But the trouble is we bring that unhealthy side too, the abandonments and the fear and the rejection and the insecurity, and those also remain. And then the adult has a chance to start to work through the unhealthy side and to heal it. So I think we all have that chance to improve our ability to relate to others, to have better, more secure relationships. But the way to do it is to resolve those early wounds. I could use the word traumas. I think that's what they are. They're traumas. But the more we resolve those traumas, the more we can change those early templates. We can't change the past, but we can change the templates upon which we base our relationships. And that, you said it, it's this is how we view friendship. And but I think in many ways that romantic relationship, the romantic relationships that we have, that's when the deepest stuff comes out, the deepest level of safety and bonding and trust, and that's when a lot of the insecurities come out. There's that old statement, if you want to really see what your flaws are, get in a relationship.
Yeah, because it's so intimate, the romantic
Yes.
relationship.
Yes, it really does replicate certain very primal aspects of a parent-child relationship, probably even I could say a mother-child relationship, whether it's a man having a relationship with a woman or a woman having a relationship with a man or gay relationships. This stuff all plays out in those super deep romantic intimate relationships. Now, I think a lot of people, to varying degrees, don't play out certain primal aspects of their early childhood relationships in their romance because they keep it pushed down. They manage to buffer the intimacy in the relationship. So I think a lot of people who are considered to have more ideal or more healthy adult romantic relationships manage to look like they're healthy, not because they've really worked out that stuff, and not because deep inside they don't have those screwed up primal templates or the templates that are partially screwed up, but because they're buffering the intimacy, so therefore that they're not tapping into that stuff. And I think many partners, that's how they survive for so long, is just that they basically have accepted that their relationships are not that intimate. They're not that intimate with their deepest partners. And so it's a lot of this stuff can be, it's what we see on the surface isn't really what's necessarily going on. So I think that it's quite possible that but I think there's also a lot of cases, like right now in the news, we have this thing with this guy, Oscar Pistorius. I don't know if you're following that. The
No,
double
I'm
amputee,
not.
the Olympic runner who's a double amputee.
Okay.
Who a year ago, he killed his girlfriend,
Hmm.
shot her. And it's in the news right now. And it's like, what I saw is, my God, his feelings, his early childhood feelings of abandonment and betrayal by his parents. This is what I'm presuming. It came up in his romantic relationship, and he flipped out. Now, he hasn't been convicted of murder. He said he killed her, but this is my assessment of what I think happened. I don't really know, but my assessment is some really early abandonment stuff came up, and he just totally flipped out and lost his temper. And there's so many different ways that can happen, but really, like, early primal abandonment can come out. Feelings can come out in a relationship, get triggered very, very easily, where a lot of times people who are in less intimate relationships don't get that early stuff triggered.
So it's very important to process what happened to you in your childhood in those early years, 3 to 7, or 1 to 7, or even earlier in life.
How about from conception to age 2?
Sure, but I'm saying from 1 to 7 because most people don't remember their early years consciously, so that's what I mean, but sure.
Yeah, but I think it all has the opportunity to be processed. It's difficult. I think it's easier to process stuff when we're 10 years old than when we were 1 year old. But from the moment of conception, when the sperm meets the egg, is when we start building our templates about human relationships.
Yeah, when we are in the womb, we also experience a lot of stuff, and this is very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, yes, processing it is the key, but it's not easy.
Of course.
Very, very, very hard. I think if it were easy, the world would be a lot healthier. There'd be a lot more people and a lot healthier relationships.
So we've talked a little bit in our last interview why it is so hard for people to do. So in summary, why do you think it's so hard for people to do? Because it's so important, and most people know that it's important, but they don't do that.
I'll try to answer your question. Why do I think it's so hard to process that stuff? I think it's hard even to acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so painful, let alone to process it. I think most people, when they're going through an eruption of their early childhood trauma stuff within their relationships, they don't even connect it to their childhood stuff. They just say that they blame the partner. They look at it as the fault of someone else. Or some people maybe get to the point and they say, I can't do relationships. I'm horrible in relationships. I have terrible abandonment issues. I flip out when my partner does this or this. But to actually get down to connecting what one is going through in relationships, be it friendship or romance, with those early childhood things, that's a leap for a lot of people. I'd say it's a leap for me sometimes. And how does one heal that? I think in the broadest theoretical way, the way to heal it is to grieve the early wounds, to grieve the loss. And that's hard. That's very difficult. I really, I I don't know. I think that takes a lot of time for a lot of people. For me, it's certainly taken a lot of time, and I'm still definitely engaged in the process. And it's, I think it's feeling those feelings, acknowledging where they're coming from, figuring out where they're coming from, exploring it, being very nurturing of ourselves, all the things that allow self-therapy to happen. But it's it's basically like adopting an abandoned infant and trying to help that infant gain a sense of safety in the world, and that's a really big thing.
So in a sense, you have to become your own parent and reparent yourself.
In a way, yes. And I think if you're going to go into those really deep levels of early abandonment, which from what I've seen, we all have them, to get into that early stuff, it's not just like reparenting, adopting yourself and reparenting yourself. It's like adopting a very troubled child. And I think a lot of people who actually do adopt real children who are not their inner self, but adopt an external child, they want to avoid adopting very troubled kids. They want to adopt children who have had at birth, who have come from a mother who was physically healthy, who wasn't all super traumatized during the pregnancy process. Now, of course, adopting any kid, you're adopting a traumatized kid because the kid's been abandoned by his or her parent. That is a trauma. But yeah, to parent ourselves it's a heck of a job, especially in the modern world that's not very supportive, that requires basically that we go out and function. And a big part of it, it's like, I think it takes a lot of time, a lot of focus, a lot of energy, a lot of ability to be with our own suffering and our own pain. And I also think there's a lot of temptation to avoid that.
And it's even harder than to parent somebody else because at that moment, part of you is a child, and you are parenting a child as a child. And sometimes you don't see yourself as a child at those moments, so it's very confusing. And
so it's harder to parent. You said it's harder to parent yourself than it is to parent somebody else?
Yeah, in a sense.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I can't necessarily speak to that, because it's also possible that parenting a child who has a lot of trauma is very difficult, because it could kick up our own trauma.
Sure.
I've seen that with parents who have adopted very traumatized children. It presses their buttons. It triggers a lot of their own unresolved trauma. So maybe it's more difficult to parent a traumatized child, because not only are we parenting that external child out there, but we're also simultaneously needing to parent ourselves, our own traumas, because they're going to come up. So maybe I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, but maybe it's easier to parent ourselves. But I also think that this idea that parents can do a good job parenting a traumatized child and help him or her get over his traumas, I don't see that too much. Maybe they can help him a bit, but I think it's a lot of work. So parenting ourselves, yeah, that's a big job. I think when people have a lot of external responsibilities to other people, it's even harder.
Yeah.
If they have to go out and work, if they have to make money, if they have children, if they're in a relationship, if they're having financial problems, if they're living in difficult circumstances.
Especially if they have children.
I think that's the most difficult, yes. When people have children, it's sort of, for most people, it's game over for healing themselves. That's what I've observed.
Yeah, me too.
It's like,
one thing that is very important in relationships, in any relationship, is boundaries. What do you think are the differences between healthy boundaries and unhealthy boundaries?
well, I think in a way, I implicitly described unhealthy boundaries before in, let's say, if we're going to talk about romantic relationships, where I think most people, they just shut down. And so their relationships are actually not that intimate. In a way, they're kind of like business partners in certain aspects, where they're not really intimately interacting. They may be having sex and sleeping in the same bed and saying I love you and raising families together, but it doesn't mean that they're really experiencing an intimacy of the souls. And in that way, that's a kind of a boundary. I would call it an unhealthy boundary because it's kind of a fake relationship. It's like they're playing relationship where they're actually really on the deeper levels not relating. And so I think a healthier boundary would be, I think there's lots of ways actually to have healthier boundaries, but I think one is definitely putting some limits on sex and sexual interaction, because I think sexual interaction really breeds a super intense intimacy that is a really quick path into super intense childhood stuff.
Yeah.
Especially for a lot of people. I think some people are very emotionally dead, and for people who are very emotionally dead, they can look at sex as just kind of a mechanistic thing. Like, it's not about emotions, it's just about a physical activity. It's almost like a recreational sport.
Or to relieve anxiety, or...
Yes. Yes. But, so I think one boundary is to put some limits on sexual interaction, even in a romantic relationship. I think another is to work really hard in a relationship, in a romantic relationship, to have an honest, healthy, self-therapeutic relationship with oneself. And to be aware when one's ancient childhood feelings are coming up. And to not have expectations on one's partner to basically fix those needs. Because I think that's the easy thing to do. That's the easy, more normal thing to do. One's, like, for instance, my early childhood needs of being abandoned by my parents could come up in a romantic relationship, and I could then not realize that that's what's going on, and instead think it's just about my partner who I'm involved with, and then expect my partner to take care of those needs. Whereas a healthier boundary would be to realize, oh, this romantic relationship is triggering some of my ancient abandonment issues. Therefore, it's not my partner's responsibility to take care of my ancient abandonment issues. It's my job to work through that grieving process. It could even be for me to say, you know, I'm actually not really ready to be in a romantic relationship at that level of intensity. It's like, maybe I can't handle that level of intimacy. So then it would be, whoa, oh, could I have a relationship that's like most people's relationships, where I just kind of shut myself down and keep a certain distance? Well, I think that's a compromise that's unhealthy, because that leads to all sorts of other problems, like people having fake relationships, playing house, having kids when they're not really ready for it. But at another level, it's I know I'm expressing a lot of conundrums. It's like a lot of this is complex. Maybe it's like, maybe I'm not ready for a relationship at all if my abandonment stuff is coming up. Or maybe it's a chance for me to take a step back in some ways, to acknowledge that this is what I'm going through, and to be very clear with that boundary that it's not my partner's responsibility to take care of me, and instead I have to do some more inner work and really devote myself to that, and then come back once more of that is healed. And I think relationships, once they get intimate, pretty clearly start to bring up a lot of that old stuff. And I think one thing that's a lot of people say in the world that do, quote, successfully get into relationships, I wouldn't necessarily call it successful, but they say that relationships are all about compromise. And that's something that I really argue with. Should a relationship be about compromise? And I think when people say compromise, it's like, oh, don't have undue expectations on the relationship. Don't think too highly. You're expecting too much out of a relationship. And I think, well, if a relationship is going to be intimate, why not expect a lot out of it? But I also think that to do that, there's a lot of pressure on a person to heal their own stuff. And so that's the boundary, to realize what's the childhood stuff that's coming up and to figure out how to heal it.
And what I have observed, that people often don't think much before getting into a relationship. It's almost automatic, and when they get into a relationship, they get, as you've mentioned, some stuff get triggered, and people get angry at their partners, and they shout or act out, and then they broke up, and then
feel hurt or feel needy, all those things.
And then they found another person, and without analyzing the past relationships, they get into another relationship, and the stuff repeats itself, and ad infinitum, basically. So one ingredient is boundaries. What are other ingredients in a healthy relationship?
self-study. The individual primarily has to have a relationship with himself.
Awareness, I would say.
Yes, sounds good. But I guess for me, I'm thinking if I'm in a relationship with a woman, my relationship with her is actually secondary to my relationship with myself.
Yes.
And so primarily, I'm still in a parenting relationship with myself. And that has to be my focus ultimately, to work on myself, to heal myself, to grow, to grieve my ancient traumas. And the relationship with a woman for me could be something that indicates more work that I have to do. But ultimately, my primary relationship has to be with me. And that's a focus that I think is going to be important for anybody. And so that's an important ingredient.
If you are in a romantic relationship, it's important that your partner had the same worldview as you do in this regard, that they would also want to work on themselves
Yes.
primarily.
Yes, because if they don't, then it's an unequal partnership.
Yeah. And what are the main differences between a friendship and a romantic relationship?
It's a good question. I think friendships are less intimate inherently.
Mm-hmm.
I think once the physical intimacy, especially the romantic sexual intimacy, enters the picture, everything changes. I think it's quite possible that, I mean, a lot of very intimate stuff obviously can happen in friendships, and friendships can go very deep. I mean, I think I have known many people who find their friendships to be much more intimate in many aspects than they find their romantic relationships. But I think that sexual stuff is just, and the romantic feelings, the sexual feelings, just inherently bring up that early childhood stuff much, much quicker. I think it somehow replicates that parent-child relationship where that the unresolved childhood need just comes up more in romance. And I think that makes things a lot more complicated. I think it's a lot easier for a person who has a lot of unresolved childhood trauma to maintain a healthier friendship than it is for them to maintain a healthier romantic relationship. It's easier to practice, it's easier to have boundaries in a friendship. I think what it is also is every romantic relationship ultimately underneath it is a friendship also. So 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 the friendship is going to be there in the romantic relationship, whether it's a good friendship or not a good friendship, and then but then it's going to be something even more. It's like the difference between riding a bicycle and riding a bicycle where you have a motor attached to it. It's like it's going to go a lot faster, and you have to be a lot better at navigating it. The balance is going to be more difficult. There's just going to be a lot of things that are going to be more difficult in a romantic relationship. So I think friendship can be a great chance to practice having boundaries, having a healthy sort of intimacy of developing give and take a lot more, developing a sense of equality, of dealing, because childhood trauma stuff, unresolved need, abandonment feelings, that can definitely all come up in friendship. And it's a good place to practice, but it's just usually not as intense.
So, to summarize, what theoretically is a healthy romantic relationship, if such a thing is possible in today's world?
Theoretically. So I'll describe it in the optimal sense.
Sure.
A healthy romantic relationship, in my opinion, would be a relationship where a person has first resolved all of their childhood traumas, so they're not playing out any childhood issues through their romantic relationships, and it's deeply intimate, so it's going down to the core of who they are. The best of them is coming out, and the best of their partner, so their partner is not also playing out stuff. It's not about ancient unmet childhood needs being played out from both sides in the relationship. It's instead about honest communication. It's about people nurturing each other's growth process. It's about having a deep friendship, a deep alliance, a mutual sense of respect, a mutual caring for each other, a mutual affection. But the basic thing is not playing out ancient unmet childhood needs. And then I think, well, there could also be all the lovely things that make romance fun, that mutual sense of attraction and that. But but I also do, again, I've written this before, but I've also wondered, I've never personally experienced it or seen it, but what would a romantic relationship be like if someone had all their childhood traumas resolved? I don't know anyone who fits the category, let alone two people who have found each other.
Yeah, me too.
So what I've hypothesized before is there might actually be a very low level of sexuality expressed. It might just be much more related, like if the people wanted to have kids, then it might be more of just a physical sense of arousal. But I think a lot of times the sex is so, and the sexual attraction is so permeated with unresolved childhood needs that if those are not there, if the childhood needs are not there, then I think the sexuality might come way, 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 way down. And so that, I think healthy relationships might have a lot less sexuality expressed. But again, I'm speaking hypothetically because I haven't experienced it. On the other hand, I have seen myself across time where I have resolved a fair amount, I don't know how much, but a fair amount of my childhood traumatic issues. And I've seen my relationships become a lot healthier. Another thing that I've seen as a result of that is I personally have seen myself been able to be much more honest with my partners and having a lot more openness and nurturance toward my partner's honesty about what they're going through. So I think a lot more honest communication can happen. I have also seen the sexuality become healthier and less needy. On the other hand, there's a flip side that as I've become healthier, and I've seen this with other people too, as people become healthier, that sometimes deeper stuff can come out, whereas before it wasn't safe to come out because there was an intuitive sense, oh my God, if some of my really deep childhood, unresolved childhood stuff comes out, it's going to kill the relationship almost instantly, so people can put it away somewhere. Versus as people get healthier, maybe they're able to bring out more stuff, so they could look even more troubled even though they're healthier. So there's a lot of things that are kind of paradoxes in this.
Yeah, so actually the next topic I wanted to touch, no pun intended, is sex. And just as a quick intro to the subject, I would like to say that, yeah, there's no secret we live in a very highly sexualized society. Mm-hmm. And to my observation, sex is an atmosphere and environment where people can very easily and in a very emotionally charged way act out their childhood experiences. And to give a minor example, let's say a person has been over-controlled as a child. They may develop submissive tendencies, or if a person had an angry caregiver, they may choose an aggressive sex partner, or if they were humiliated, they may enjoy having sex where they are humiliated, or
the opposite in all three, I was thinking. So if they've been humiliated, they can turn around and become a humiliator. And if they're controlled, they can become a very controlling partner, things like that. So they could play out both sides.
Yeah, there are many examples, but I'm just throwing out some of them. Sure. So things like spankings, humiliation, control, pain, fear, and stuff like that become associated with pleasure in those moments. And that way you can avoid the horrors of your childhood and reenact the same psychological dynamic that happened when you were a child. And I'm wondering, could you talk more about the psychological aspect of sex and how and why people use sex for various psychological purposes?
Well, I'm going to try it out hypothetically, but the idea that pops into my head is that deep down underneath it all, we all secretly want to heal. We want to heal that ancient childhood stuff. And so I think a lot of the motivation for sex is really a misplaced motivation to heal that stuff. So it's like we're not actually healing it, we're instead acting it out and replicating it. And it's like it's a second best, because really healing it is a different angle. But the replicating it, in a way, replicating it and acting out what happened. Yes, there's a desire to heal it in there, but I think a lot of people through sex and sexuality are trying to gain a mastery over their childhood issues. And they're trying to in a way, reenact emotionally what happened to them, or sometimes even physically what happened to them, but to now gain that sense of mastery, that sense of control, whereas when they were a child, they had much less control. And as an adult sexual partner, we, as just by very nature of being adults, in some sort of equal or semi-equal adult relationship, we have more control.
So people try to change their past by trying to change their present, in a sense.
Yeah.
And it's not
so
possible.
It's all unconscious.
Yeah.
It's by definition, it's unconscious.
Yeah.
But
and why do you think this form of projection, of acting out, is so appealing to us? This form meaning sex.
Because there's a certain amount of pleasure associated with it, whereas a lot of the healing process is not pleasurable. The grieving and the suffering and the grieving and all that upwelling stuff doesn't feel good. And so by engaging in sexual intimacy with somebody else, we play it out, we put some pleasure into it, we get a feeling of safety, we get a feeling of control, that all things that we didn't have when we were young, and being traumatized, being rejected in various ways, having our needs not be met by the people who were responsible to take care of our needs. And so the safety and that sense of pleasure that comes out of it now is like, ooh, we get a feeling that we've conquered that issue, even though we don't even necessarily know what we're going through. But then what happens is when the relationship doesn't work, when the sexuality doesn't solve the problem, with a sex or sexual intimacy doesn't heal those ancient traumas, then afterwards, that's when people suffer horribly and all the pain does come up. When the relationship fails, the mourning, the grieving, the fuck, I screwed up, and sometimes people have to hit the ground pretty hard. The failures are pretty ugly. Like, not only do they suffer the rejection and the pain, but they can end up getting diseases and having children, or really, doing things that really hurt other people badly. And so it's, I think it's a pretty bad long-term investment to unconsciously try to resolve emotional stuff through sexuality.
So what, in your opinion, would be a healthy approach towards sex? Again, probably theoretically.
Well, I can tell you how I would have answered that 3 or 4 years ago.
Go ahead.
Which I was very clear about it, which is celibacy is the answer. The answer is to try to work through that stuff by going into it without including another person in it sexually. Even for a while, I tried a couple of years of not even masturbating. So basically, I was taking no proactive role in my own life to manifest my sexuality. In fact, I was taking a totally passive role in manifesting my sexuality, to the point that for 2 years of not masturbating, I was even just letting myself have wet dreams at night. But that's what I tried. I'm in a different stage now, where I still am very careful about sex, but I wouldn't say I'm, by any definition, strictly celibate. It's like not really sexually active in any sort of traditional sense, but much more open to it and willing to try stuff. And to some degree, yeah. And so for me now, I guess why it's a little bit more complex for me to answer that question about what's a healthy approach is I don't feel what I've been trying the last couple of years, which I'm more open to sexual interacting, I don't feel it's necessarily unhealthy, because I feel like what I'm doing is exploring and trying things and seeing how things feel and learning lessons. And also, I was celibate, like, where I didn't basically even kiss anyone for 10 years, let alone anything more than kissing. I was like not even doing anything, not even holding hands or having any sort of dating. That I would say where I'm at now is testing the waters and seeing how does it feel. I came up with a lot of theories in 10 years. I tried a lot of stuff that was very different from what almost anybody I knew was trying. And I went off really far on my own path, on my own vector of trying new things and thinking ideas that I basically knew almost nobody who was even testing this stuff in any way, let alone theorizing about it. And so I feel for the scientist part of me, there really is some value in trying things out. I'm cautious about it. I'm not like going headlong into having sex. I'm not. But I feel like I'm testing stuff. I'm learning a lot of lessons, and for me, that has been kind of healthy because it's sparking new ideas, and it's giving a different perspective on my 10 years of celibacy. So now when I talk about celibacy, it's like I'm talking about it a bit from a distance and studying it, and it's also like it's an interesting thing because I don't at the present moment don't have the same mindset. So I would say for a lot of people it could be of great value to try celibacy or to try a lot more celibacy. I don't know how extreme a person wants to go. I think again for me the extreme of celibacy was 2 years where I didn't even masturbate. But I don't know. I think healthy sexuality, it's like healthy sexual relations. Well, I think the first thing is if it's heterosexual sexual interacting, first be very careful not to produce children. So for me, that's just basic bottom line. Protect one's body, not to get or give diseases. That's really, really important. That's a basic part of health. But I think also to really develop a very strong, intimate friendship with whatever partner one has. So I think the idea of casual sex is like, no. Casual sexual interaction, I do think it's much better and much healthier if sexual interaction happens within a deeply intimate friendship, a friendship that's already strong and intimate. And I think that the sexuality should not be more intimate than the friendship is. I think that's very difficult. I think that's very difficult to achieve, but I think it's also things to be explored. But I don't know. I think what I'm saying now is a little bit less black and white than what I said a few years ago, because I think my whole life right now is a bit less black and white than it was a few years ago. But I don't think that takes away from the validity of what I was saying a few years ago when I was in deep in celibacy. And often I look back at it and I'm like, I wonder if I was more healthy when I was celibate. But on the other hand, it's like I'm really wildly exploring stuff and testing stuff out. And I think that the results of this phase of experimentation I'm in will give me a more solid grounding in what healthy sexuality is. So I think I'm still exploring these questions. That's why when you told me today what we were going to be talking about, I was like, whoa, I'm getting into one that's, it's a little harder now because I'm in the middle of the mix. I'm not talking from such a distance.
So again, probably it's very important to be self-aware and self-reflective what's going on and to learn from what you are experiencing.
Yes, simultaneously to whatever I'm doing in an intimate way, to really be studying myself, like now more than ever, really important. But I think when people are getting into sexuality and interaction and romance, it's often a very hard time to self-study because the stuff is coming up so fast, and it's coming up in relation to another person. A lot of times people avoid the self-therapeutic process almost entirely, or sometimes entirely, by just not even realizing that this has anything to do with one's intimate deep stuff from childhood. So I think, certainly very important to be doing self-analysis of some sort.
Yeah, so now I would like to change the topic a little bit and talk about an adult's relationship with his or her parents.
Right.
Wow, from sex to parents, I think Freud is nodding in approval in his grave right now, but yeah.
Recently, except he probably did very little of this analyzing himself in any realistic way.
Yeah, I agree.
I just feel like it's interesting. I got so little out of studying that guy.
Yeah, my opinion of Freud is not that great.
No.
And from what I've heard from you, it's your experience too.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say I've read a ton of Freud, but mostly because it's just...
Yeah, but all the sexual stuff, and it's nasty.
Weird stuff. Yeah, it just turned me off. I'm like, dude, this guy is not a role model for me. And look at how many kids he had, and screwed up weird dad, and like a horrible role model for a lot of people. I'm just, blah, forget it. So anyways, but what were you going to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that recently you have published a new book called Breaking Away from Your Parents, or Breaking from Your Parents. And for many people, this is a very controversial topic. And a lot of people, I would say, can't even grasp that there's a possibility to
Mm-hmm.
to not be in an unhealthy relationship with your parents or with your family members, or even question the quality of your relationship with your family. So to
Right.
people who haven't contemplated this thought before, what does it mean to break away or break from your parents?
Mm. Well, I think there's two basic aspects to the subject of breaking from one's parents. One is to literally break from the actual people and to have much less or no actual contact with them. That's one side of it. And the other side is to break from the parents that are within us. And
So it's
because,
physical and psychological, emotional, two aspects.
well, but not exactly, because when we break from the actual people, the physical break, that also involves a psychological, emotional break.
Yeah, but
But
some people break physically, but don't break away psychologically and emotionally.
right. I think that, well, I think one, yeah, I think it's not exactly what I'm getting at though, because I think like breaking from the actual people is it is a psychological process also. But I think I think what I mean is just, and I think you know this too, but it's like the parents that we've internalized. That is also the breaking process. That is also a psychological, emotional process, and the two can really overlap. But yes, there are people who have broken physically, geographically, maybe even to some degree emotionally from their parents, but they haven't done it internally.
Yeah, that's
And,
why I meant that's what I meant. That some people just say fuck
yeah,
you and leave their parents and not
right,
they don't do any self work. So yeah, but
right,
go ahead.
right, exactly. And so, and I think still, even still, people who just break away from their parents without doing the internal work, um, that still can be valid. It
Yeah,
still can be healthy
they
to
are
break
doing
away.
in some ways better than people who are in relationships with
Yes.
their.
But many times it can be also really fucked up because there are people who break away from their parents, but if they don't do the internal work, what they can end up doing, and they usually do, is they end up just replicating it all over the place. Like there's people who say, I broke away from my parents were horrible, they treated me horribly, I got away from them, but they didn't see how much they were like their parents, and then they end up having kids.
Yeah, they are
And
living with their mother basically.
yes, well, actually, no, their child is living with their mother.
Oh yeah, that too.
Yeah, because their child basically, yeah, and so they're projecting their parental stuff onto their children, but also their children are having to deal with a screwed up parent who's very much like the parent that they supposedly broke away from, but only broke away from physically. So it's those two things. And the deeper one to me is the internal breaking from the parents. That's the one that's more significant. But in our modern world, both are considered taboo. I mean, I think when you talk about the internalized parent and breaking from that internalized parent, most people don't even get that. Like, that's not something that they see because I think the average person in the world doesn't even think about unconscious processes. They just think about manifest content. They think about what they can see on the surface. And they can see, well, why'd you break from your parents? You know, what did they do to you that was so bad? But they were good parents. I don't get it. That's selfish of you. Or learn to forgive and all that crap and let go and blah, blah, blah. But I think yes, it's much more difficult, and I think it's much more difficult to do that deep internal breaking. But I have seen also people who are very primitive; they're not very evolved, but they've broken from their parents in actual like physical reality, and they can get other people to understand. All they say is, "Yeah, my dad was a rapist. He was a fucking asshole. He raped me, and fuck him, and I hate him, and I'm away from him, and I have nothing to do with him. And why should I be around someone who did that horrible stuff to me? And he beat me up even when I was an adult." And 99.9% of people are going, "Yeah, that makes sense." And but it gets a lot more complicated when people don't have an easy pat answer like my father raped me, I don't want to be around him. It's a little it's a lot more difficult to explain to someone, yeah, my parents were way better than average. And I would say this would be my story, which is a lot more difficult to explain. Yeah, there was substance abuse problems. Yeah, my parents fought. Yeah, my dad, was physically abusive with me sometimes. Yeah, my mom was sort of emotionally incestuous in some awful ways. But my parents also were extremely loving in a lot of ways. There was a very stable household. There was enough money. There was a lot of nurturance. There was dinner every night at the same time as a family. We did family vacations. There was a lot of fun times. There was a lot of wonderful stuff. I feel like I was given a lot of a chance to become a really good, healthy, productive, mature adult. as the result of the good things that came out of my family. And when I describe that, people say, well, you're selfish to break from them. You owe them stuff. Why would you do that? And it's like, well, because there was also simultaneously a lot of unhealthy stuff. And I think a lot of people who haven't dealt with a lot of the internal world tend to see things much more in black and white and don't get it. And that's where they're like, but yeah, your parents were really loving. They weren't horrible, brutal people in a lot of ways. The brutal stuff may have been pretty limited. So that's where, you should do what the Dalai Lama says and learn how to forgive. And anger is unhealthy in that way. And it's like, really, if you want to move on with your life and have loving relationships and be a good person in the world, you've got to forgive them because they did the best they could. A lot of bullshit.
Yeah.
They did the best they could to me doesn't mean anything because it's true. Everybody does the best they could. It's like people don't want to be evil. People want to be good. And yet they still do horrible things that really traumatize people. And for me and for other people that I've observed, to the point that I would say it's universal, for people really to heal that deep internal stuff, they need to get away from the people who did that to them. And they need to be with themselves, and they need to feel their feelings, and they need to feel their rage and their anger and their sadness and their grief and their loneliness. And a lot of times that's just not possible. And I think also at a fundamental level, ultimately, if people are going to go the full step to really heal themselves, they're going to have to get away from those people. It's a necessity to get away from those people, and also to see what are the internalized, screwed up parents that we all have within us, to be able to just identify how screwed up we all are and how much we've internalized our screwed up parents. We have to be away from the people who did that stuff to us, and we also have to, in a way, take a step out of ourselves and really nurture the healthiest part of ourselves to be able to acknowledge how screwed up we all are. And so to realize that, to really get back to what we were talking before, to really parent ourselves, if you want to use that word, it's like, it takes a lot of consciousness, a lot of maturity, a lot of dedication, and a lot of strength to be loving with ourselves in that way. And that, I don't know, I feel like I've gone off on kind of a tangent and I lost where I started, but so I'll just stop there. So what's a healthy way to be? I'd say for me, the healthiest thing is to be far away from my family, to become independent emotionally, break away. But I think it's possible that in an ideal world where parents didn't have unresolved childhood traumas and therefore weren't turning around and foisting their unresolved traumas on their children, they weren't replicating their traumas on their children, they weren't doing the intergenerational cycle of transmitting trauma, that a child could grow up and naturally break away emotionally and become independent from their parents and still live in their same house. Not necessarily need to have so much distance from their family. They could be a part of the same tribe as their parents and have their parents be a part of their emotional lives and yet also be independent from them. I just think that's in an ideal setting where people have resolved all their traumas. I think anybody who says they're doing that is fooling themselves nowadays. It's like, I just don't see it. I do know a lot of people who maintain relationships with their parents, and I meet people who say, yes, I've really broken from my parents. I've become independent. I have a mature, separate, adult, intimate relationship with my parents, but we're very close still and we hang out. We've become friends now. We don't see, it's not a parent-child relationship. And I go, I don't believe it. I don't see that. And I don't feel it's my place to go around calling people on that directly to their face, but I'd say I don't believe it. I don't see it. That's not how I assess the situation. So I think in the modern world where you get parents that haven't resolved all their issues, then it's healthy for children to break away, get away from those people, and get the chance to work out your own internal stuff. Because I think when people remain close to their parents, like physically close to their parents, geographically close to their parents, and their parents have unresolved stuff, it's like the children are going to be affected by that negatively. So I guess that's my answer. It's a little bit more nuanced, and probably I could even describe it more, but that's sort of what comes to my mind. That's my experience. That's my hypothesis. That's my observation.
What about confrontation? Some people sometimes confront their family members, and this might happen directly or indirectly. Indirectly, I mean, like by writing letters they don't send, or just journaling for themselves. So do you think it might be useful to, let's say, confront your family members about your childhood experiences or about discomfort in being in a relationship with them?
Yes, it can definitely be useful. But again, you put it in two different ways. There's the confrontation that actually happens. There's so many. I could put it this way: it's different levels of confrontation. Like the mildest level might be like writing a letter, or thinking about it, or confronting them in your own mind, or talking about it with a friend or with a therapist. And
Yeah, I guess meant more directly.
yes, but then yeah, and so the milder level, I'm just trying to create the continuum. At the milder level, it's sort of confronting in one's own mind, confronting in one's relationship with oneself on paper, writing letters, typing something out, and then but never even the parent might not even know that that's going on. But and then a more intense level of confrontation is the direct sending the letter, sending the email, looking the person in the eye, talking on the telephone, and then the most extreme would be meeting in person, a direct confrontation. It could take the form of accusations. It could take the form of asking questions. Why did you do that? Or could take the form of, when you did that to me, this is how I felt. Sharing. And I think all of that potentially could be of great value. And there may be different times where anything on that continuum could be of deep value. I think that there's certain things that should be avoided. I think pretty universally, like physical violence
Sure.
as a form of confrontation. Don't do it. It's bad. It leads to bad results. That's unhealthy. But I think sometimes yelling at a person might be healthy. Accusing them of stuff, I think it's risky. As soon as the confrontations start to involve actual interactions, the risk level goes way, way up. But I think that there's other ways. There's even quiet ways, silent ways. One could say totally non-aggressive ways. Though I think, though I really don't. That's a different subject about aggressive ways of confrontation, because what is that? But I think just pulling away, not answering a phone call, not answering an email. Someone comes to your door and rings the bell, and you see that it's your mom or your dad, and you don't want to talk to them, to just refuse to answer the door. That's a confrontation of sorts. That's making a loud statement. But I think in terms of actually taking a step forward and saying, you did this, or why did you do this, or this is how I felt, that can be very healthy for a lot of people. It can be very empowering. That confrontation can be amazing. It can be very empowering for people, but again, quite risky. So it's something to go into. I'd say, to go into it with a lot of thought, with a lot of caring, maybe with an ally there, maybe bouncing ideas off allies first, because confrontations can very easily become very emotional, and they can look. It's a confrontation. Not everyone responds well. People can respond horribly. I've heard a lot of stories of and experienced it personally when confrontations haven't gone well. They can get ugly. Bad things can
And it
happen.
also triggers a lot of stuff for you, the person who confronts your.
Oh, it can be terrifying.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, what is that statistic about rape victims in the United States? It's like, it's a small percentage of rape victims who actually even prosecute their rapist. When they even know who the rapist is, they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have to deal with the legal system and the whole confrontation and admitting what happened and maybe having to see that person again. It's a lot easier often to just avoid it and just move on and get away from it. And I think that's often just as true, sometimes less, but sometimes even more true with people and their parents, because parents can have such power over a child that for the child, even grown up, to confront the parent about stuff that was traumatizing can be a horror, it can be terrifying. And so I don't know. I think it's like, but even a confrontation that's really scary or could go badly or does go badly, all these things still offer the possibility of incredible growth and learning. It's like you were asking earlier, what is a healthy sexual relationship? Well, even if someone is in a somewhat unhealthy sexual relationship, they can still learn a lot. There's still a lot of information and emotional lessons that can be mined from those kind of experiences. So I don't know. I've seen people do it, that they've had confrontations that have gone really badly, but they've learned a lot. And they've learned not only about themselves, but they've learned about the character and the nature and the behavior of the person that they're confronting, their traumatizers. And so what I've seen for me, even personally, is the most poignant is seeing often how horribly my parents responded when I confronted them, whether it was even a mild confrontation, but just how poorly they responded, and sometimes really, really poorly responded.
And that's when you were an adult, so you can only
As an
imagine
adult,
how
yes.
were you
And
when you were a child,
a
how
really
things went.
independent, mature adult who was making my own living,
Yeah.
independent and working as a professional, and me confronting them and seeing how horribly they responded, and maybe how, yes, I didn't necessarily, sometimes I responded really well to their poor responses, sometimes not so well, but what I gained out of seeing how they responded was, bing, the light bulb went off for me, that I thought, oh my God, this really poor response that I'm receiving is from the very people who once had almost complete, or actually complete, power over my life, that this went this badly. It's like, no wonder I couldn't break away from them when I was a child. No wonder I couldn't confront them when I was a child. No wonder I couldn't express so many of my deeper needs and my hurt and my sadness and my anger at them. Because if it was this difficult for me as a really radically independent adult, 1,000 times more difficult as a totally dependent child who couldn't even take care of myself, who had $7 in the bank, or didn't even have a bank account, and wasn't even legally independent. If I'd run away, the police would have brought me back. Or even worse, they would have put me into foster care. So those confrontations that went poorly, when my parents responded very, very poorly, and they mostly did, really, I learned a lot, because it was just like a bell went off, and I learned a lot about my childhood. And I had so much more empathy for the little child that I was, that I said, oh God, that poor little guy that I was, like what I had to go through. And sometimes the confronting was the thing that really shined the light in my face, that made me realize, oh my God, that was the character of the people who raised me. And it gave me a lot more support in a way for realizing this is why I wanted to break away from them. This is why I didn't like them in so many ways. This is why I really, at a deep level, felt they were in many ways horrible people. So, but I would say the main thing is, again, that people take care not to hurt themselves too much, because it's like anything that we go into that's risky. It's a cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be gained, but there's also potentially a lot to lose. I mean, I've heard of people who have gotten arrested as the result of confrontations. I've heard people who've been attacked physically. I've heard of people who have been cut out of the family will. I've heard of people who have been psychiatrically hospitalized as a result of confrontation. I've heard of people who've been forced to take psychiatric medication. All sorts of things like that. I've heard of people who were very dependent on their parents in some ways, like living in their parents' home, and then got thrown out as a result of a confrontation. I've heard of people who have had their extended family shun them as the result of a confrontation. I've heard of people whose siblings have gone against them. I've heard of even people whose intimate partners, their spouses, have turned against them as a result of confrontations. So all these things. And I've also heard of people who have felt so absolutely guilty after a confrontation. They overestimated their emotional strength when they confronted a parent, maybe got rejected or got attacked back, and then they went into a spiral where they dissociated. The horror of their parents' reaction was so terrible that they went into a terrible depression as a result, and maybe couldn't pull out of it. So all these things, again, are possibilities where a person could still learn to work better with themselves. But it was yes. So basically, yeah, there's a lot of risk in it. So a person, I would say, if I was going to give advice to someone who really was hell bent on confronting their parents, it's like, go slow. Try it slowly. Try it on the milder end of the spectrum first. Maybe try sending a letter or an email before you meet with them face to face and have a go at them. Things like that.
Or just write it down, even not send it at all.
Yes. But if someone really does want to have their parent hear their confrontation, to try it in a mild way first, and try it, see how the parent responds, see how they feel, and let it wait a while, maybe wait a month or two before taking it to the next level, if a person really has an urge to take it to the next level.
So any other advice for a person who is contemplating breaking away from family or are in progress of it?
Well, build good allies. That really helps. I think a big problem that I've seen many people have is when they break from their families, that they don't have a social world to catch them. So if people are very still emotionally dependent on their parents or their families, if they're going to break away from their families, they can lose a lot of their emotional support. Even if it's unhealthy emotional support, they're still getting support. So I think for some people, if they try to break from their families and they're expecting that life's going to be easy, a lot of times it's not. So again, a lot of work can be done before breaking from one's parents, or even breaking from one's parents within, by building a support network, building healthy friends, building other supportive alliances. I mean, I'm not a big proponent of therapy, but I think people could potentially find a therapist who's supportive, find people, maybe support groups, just have good healthy activities, have good work, make sure a person is more financially stable. Also, if people are going to break away from their family and they're still getting money from their family, that can be a real problem. And so better to be financially independent, geographically independent, have one's own place to live. Basically, it helps to be more of an adult when one breaks away. The consequences are less.
So again, probably working on yourself would be helpful.
Yes, developing a strong relationship with oneself, having a good, strong self-therapeutic relationship, if you want to use that word, with oneself before one starts getting into the territory of making more extreme steps toward breaking from one's parents. Sometimes, though, maybe it's the best thing to just get the hell away from toxic people no matter what. Sometimes, so I don't want to say it across the boards. It's like, oh, take care, be careful. But I think if all things are equal, it's like better to do it in a slow, safe way, and to not be too extreme unless it's really obviously necessary.
And I'm just curious, what is people's reaction to your book so far?
Generally, it's been positive. Um, I've had some. Generally, it's been surprisingly positive. I was very surprised. I got an email a few days ago from a woman I know through mental health work. She's been very involved in trying to promote some of my mental health movies and some of these ideas. And I never thought that she would be someone who would be at all interested in breaking from family, and or at least in a more extreme way, like I write about. And she's also extremely religious, like very Christian. And it's like she was surprisingly very, very positive. This is just one example of my book and thinking about it and thinking of the value in the subject matter. And so generally, yeah, it's been pretty surprisingly positive. I didn't think very many people would like it at all. It's been starting slowly, though. I mean, I'm not much into self-promotion. I think
Mm.
maybe sometimes it would benefit me if I figured out how to put a little bit more energy into promoting myself, but that doesn't really turn me on. But so I don't know. I mean, I don't even know how many people have read it, but it's only been out a few weeks, so probably not a ton of people. But I think I'm trying to think if I've gotten any really negative feedback. I mean, um, I think one thing also is negative feedback is a funny thing. I think a lot of people could think negative thoughts, and I wouldn't even know it. Because the other thing is, it's like a good chunk of the book is already present on an Amazon Kindle. You can actually sample like the first, I don't know how many pages. So there's a lot of very personal stuff in those pages. It could be thousands of people have already read that stuff and never bought the book and never going to give me feedback. But I don't know. Feedback I've gotten, what's the response been? Well, one of my fears is that horrible stuff was going to happen and my world was going to start crumbling and everybody's going to hate me and I was going to get a lot of rejection. And so far that hasn't happened. Probably it's been a lot more silence.
Mm.
You know, it's been mostly positive, some very positive responses. Some people have said it's very helpful. Um, I think that, yeah, mostly it's been very positive. People have said it's been helpful. But then there have been surprises, like this woman who's very Christian, who just was like very positive about it. It's like, I mean, my book is overtly not religious. It's like it's anti-religious, and so it's a surprise when people who are totally what I would consider to be sort of in a different camp of thinking than I am found value in it. That to me is it's a little bit even more meaningful than someone who's like very much allied with my thinking who thinks it's a great book.
And did anyone from your family contact you about this book?
No, no one has even mentioned that it came out. I've taken care. The only people that I mention directly as people are my parents and my grandparents. Everybody else is anonymized. Like I don't talk about sibling stuff with direct names or genders or specific about people. It's like I really tried to keep it. Um, I used a lot more disguise, and I was very open that I was using disguises because I just felt like my parents, just by the very nature of having had me, that they've lost their right to confidentiality. And at the same time, I don't wish to hurt them. I don't wish my book to be a weapon against them. It's like I don't. It's been an interesting part of my process of breaking from my parents that at least the last year, year and a half or so, I haven't found myself feeling much anger at them. And I did have a lot of anger for a lot of years, so I know that feeling. And I think the anger that I had for a lot of years was excellent because it was part of the mortar that I used to build boundaries with them. But now it's like I think my boundaries are deeper, and I just haven't had much need for the anger. And I also have had very little desire to get any sort of revenge. I think also, but on the flip side of that, I've had very little desire to have them come and take care of me. And, and so if I could have my wish, it's like I really don't want my parents to read my book. I, I don't know. I'm just sort of not very concerned with them. I kind of gave up on them growing. That's been a big part of my process too, that at a certain point, and I think all the confrontations I had with them over the years taught me this ultimately, that those people are really stuck. They're not growing, and I'm just kind of like, I'm just not that interested in them anymore. I mean, I still do dream about them sometimes. Sometimes I do have painful dreams, but not nearly as much as when I used to. And I think what's actually interesting is I've thought about them more as I've gone more into exploring romance, because the romance stuff does bring up some of the earlier primal stuff that I haven't totally dealt with. But I think in a lot of my day-to-day life, my parents, like a lot of the stuff that used to kick up parental stuff, I resolved it. I worked through a lot of it. But I think my unresolved stuff now has gone into even deeper stuff. But I don't know. No, I haven't gotten any feedback from them. I doubt I will. I hope I don't. I don't really have any desire to discuss any of this stuff with them. I mean, let's just say my mom read my book, and it triggered some sort of growth process in her, and she wanted to discuss stuff with me. I think unless I saw incredibly clear, specific evidence that she was profoundly growing, I'm not even really interested in what she has to say. Just like I've tried that one so many times that it's not something that motivates me. So frankly, I don't want to discuss any of this with my family. So if they reached out to me about this, I have a hard time imagining myself replying. Now, if they wanted to like sue me or something like that, I mean, I don't see how they could win because what I said is true, and and I'm not saying this to hurt them. I'm saying this to help the world and to share ideas with the world. But really, I don't. No, I'm just not particularly interested. I think it's a lot easier for people to write about this stuff if their parents are already dead. Like Alice Miller's son wrote his biography of his mother after she died. It's like, I get that. My parents happen to both still be alive. They probably both have many years in front of them. And it could be up to 20 or 30 years in front of them. So I just felt like the point I am at my life, I don't really feel like waiting 10, 20, 30 years to write about this stuff. It's like, I've got it. It's here and now. Get it out there. And I feel like, let's say I became a parent. I don't have any plans to. I don't want to become a parent. I think it would be a bad idea. But if I did, I feel just by the nature of creating someone else's existence that that person has the right to speak about me, talk about the family secrets, let that stuff out.
Yeah.
And so that's why I don't feel bad doing it. I don't feel like I betrayed them. I mean, these are thoughts that definitely went through my head. Am I betraying them? And I'm like, no, they betrayed me. With the horrible stuff they did. I mean, conceivably, my parents could read this and find value in it. I think anybody could. I think a lot of the stuff is just not written about that much. And so anybody who's dealing with unresolved childhood issues with their parents could benefit incredibly greatly from it. My parents included, because they're so unresolved with their childhood issues with their own parents. Even though both of my parents have no parents left on Earth, all four of my grandparents have died.
And how challenging was it for you internally to write this book and to publish it?
Hell and hell. It was a very difficult process. I think what my experience of myself as a writer is that I'm a clear thinker and I can express my thoughts very fluidly through writing. It's not hard for me. And so your question about how difficult was it to write this book, I got evidence that was very difficult for me to write because it was like it took me a while to write it. It was like I had a lot of fears, and it was the fears that were blocking my thoughts and my expression of them. It was stressful. It was a difficult process. I had a lot of nightmares. I actually write about that in the book. I write about the process of writing the book and how difficult it was, how painful. And it's publishing it was also very difficult. Publishing it was its own terror. It was like I really had to go through a lot of stuff to take the deep breath and go for it and get it out there, because I think in one level, I was afraid of my parents' reaction to the book. I had to get over that and get through it. And the other one was the world could hate me. The world could, especially like my professional world and old friends of mine, people could read this and say, Daniel's a nutcase. He's crazy. Or they could just put me in a little box. Oh, he hates his parents. He's just a spoiled kid, and who's being a teenager but just expressing it through an adult lens, blah, 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 blah. Those are the voices in my head. That is my internalized parents talking. Blah, 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 blah. And I had to work through a lot of that. I wouldn't say I'm totally resolved with it. I still think I had fears about publishing it. It was sort of like, oh shit. But I've also noticed in any book I publish, any ideas that I publish, it's always difficult because I have high standards that I hold myself to, that I want it to be as good as I could possibly make it. And I feel like I've got a lot of skill as a thinker and writer, so it's like I really want to make it really, really good. And it's frightening that I'm putting something out that might be substandard. But on the other hand, it's like that's what I ultimately had to decide is what is my standard, because I didn't want to hold on to the book forever. I could have sat down and kept it in my hard drive of my computer and waited a whole year and then gone back and read it and then said, oh, well, maybe I could change this or this or this, or change this a little bit or find a typo here and there. But ultimately, for me, it was an interesting process I had of writing this book where I never realized it when I went into writing it, because I wrote it to be useful to other people, to share my ideas with the world and with other people in the world. But actually, there was something I went through my own emotional process while writing this book, while preparing these ideas for public consumption. It actually was a kind of self-therapeutic process. And as the result of writing the book, I think it actually helped me crystallize a lot of my ideas and work through some stuff emotionally, of constantly going through the terror and the nightmares and the fears. Every time I went back to writing that book, I got stronger. And what happened is within a year of writing the first, from writing the first draft of that book and starting it, from starting the first draft of the book to publishing it was 2 years. It was a 2-year process. And somewhere in that period, probably a year into that 2-year process, I found myself in a way kind of losing interest in the subject matter, because I kind of worked through it. I'd said what I wanted to say. And so I took off at one point, maybe almost a year, where I didn't even look at the book, just to let it sit inside of me so I could come back to it with fresh eyes. But when I came back to it, I was surprised. I didn't think it was going to be as good as it was. It surprised me. It was better than I thought, because somehow in my mind I thought it was going to be weaker. And I remember it was last summer. Now is March of 2014. It was about August of, no, it was July maybe of 2013. I looked at it and I was like, oh, this book is good. It's almost ready to get out there. But I also found, Daniel, don't hold on to this any longer. You need to put this book out and let it go. Move on. It's like, live my life. It was something it was a big project of mine that needed to get out there. I have one other big project that I'm working on that's a big thing that I need to just release, and that's almost done.
Would you mind sharing what it is? Or
yeah. You know it. You've even been kind of a part of it. Is getting my movies out there more. I haven't announced that publicly, so I'm not going to say too much more about it.
Okay.
But I will be doing a public announcement in the next few weeks about this big shift I'm doing with my movies. But yeah, it's a big part of my letting go of an old phase. Like breaking from my parents in a way is ideas that I've worked through a lot. And it's like, and this thing with my movies, working through it and letting it go so I can turn and go in a different direction and grow in a new way and open myself up to new unknowns and fears. And that's scary. I do have a lot of fears, but I'm moving forward.
And to those who were not familiar with you before, where can they find your work?
My website is wildtruth.net, or they could just Google me if they want to put a little effort into it. You know, I have my YouTube channel. I somehow or other, Daniel Mackler, dmackler58, I can't remember. But there's many ways to find me. I think it seems like Googling me is probably the easiest.
Yeah, as always, I'll put the links in the description box below to your website, to your YouTube channel, to your new book. So, yeah, thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you. Great questions, Darius.
Yeah, okay, see you. Bye, Daniel. And thank you all for watching. Bye.